The first use of the word coach in connection with instruction arose in 1830 on the campus of Oxford University. Like a horse-driven coach, the word coach became slang for a tutor who carried a student through an exam. The word coaching thus identified a process used to transport people from where they are to where they want to be. And the coach's purpose at the time, unlock a student's full potential to maximize their performance. But in the modern era, the word coach is often most associated to a sport or a game, like baseball and football. And it implies that three key principles are needed: competition, cooperation, and struggle. To our listeners, think about the best coach you ever had. What does he or she do? Rather than tell or teach, the great ones both inspire and provoke a change in your mindset. They augment your skill set, but even better, they help you to find and to align your passion and purpose. Thus, it is a pleasure to introduce to our audience a couple who lives and breathes a critical coaching concept. They dedicate their lives by going to work every day in the service of someone else's success. And as the partners of the Kelley Group, they're professional speakers, authors, TV show creators, and hosts, and they help each other and they help others master a game, not just the game of business, but they coach their clients to dream beyond their limits, but to create a platform to help them succeed beyond their wildest imagination. How do they do it? It's easy. They make their clients feel like they are playing a game. And today, they will discuss a model of how they transformed their lives on the path to transforming others. I'm Chuck Garcia. Welcome to A Climb to the Top. And our guests today are Sarano and Brooke Kelley. Sarano and Brooke, welcome to A Climb to the Top.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you very much. I was inspired myself by that opening.
Yeah.
That was great.
I appreciate that, but I have to say you guys made it really easy because on our pre-call, when we got to know each other, and then I after our pre-call, I was inspired to read a book that, I've got a bit of a background issue here, but this is called The Game, Win Your Life in 90 Days. And I have to say, Serrano, it was a wonderful book. As a teacher, if I could redesign my curriculum at Columbia, I would include this book with my students, because I think this is the book that high school and college students aren't getting that I think they should. Have you ever, either one of you ever had that feedback?
Actually, we led the game not just on Wall Street and in television shows, which is what it's most famous for, but in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and certainly colleges. And you're quite right. You know, kids, they have this ability to be flexible and fluid in their thinking. And the moment we give them this structure, they actually have better performance than adults using the 90-day game.
Well, let's talk about that. But before I do that, I want to get to your background. So we introduced you guys to our listening audience. And then I want to talk about your own transformation and how you transform others. Brooke, let me start with you. You are, what I know about you, this is a lot because you make a lot public, which I really appreciate it. But tell us, from your Pepperdine days or even before, how did you evolve into ultimately becoming the coach that you are?
It's so interesting because lately I've been reflecting on this, and I think that although I thought I was coaching our clients, they've taught me so much. So over the years, it really happened organically. There was one advisor, financial advisor in particular, who was and is quite successful, and I spent the last decade coaching him. And although he considers me his coach, I believe I've learned more from him than I have imparted, and I'm very grateful for that. So I would say that, to answer your question, it was a very organic process. When I first worked with Serrano, it was much more about the operations. And there was a day when he couldn't make a call. I filled in.
Hey, I need a pinch hitter. Hey, what the heck? Let's hire you full time. You're pretty good at it. Was it something like that?
It was more like, I don't have to pay you. You're my wife. You know a thing or two about what we do. My flight is not going to be timed, and I need you to do the following. And I remember being incredibly nervous. But after I led the call, we had tremendous feedback, which was a bit surprising to me given my nerves. And it really rolled from there. And I feel like our clients have been incredibly generous. But as I said, it's been organic. It wasn't planned. And they have taught me much more than I have taught them. And I've been very grateful for that.
Well, what you are laying down the tracks for any teacher, the old adage, once taught, twice learned. But the important part about you as a coach, you took inspiration from someone who may hand you the baton so that you may teach others. Is that a fair way of concluding your practice?
I would say so, yes.
Oh, it's fantastic. Well, thank you. Now, Serrano, we're both New Yorkers. I grew up a little bit north of the borough of Brooklyn, but your story is an interesting one because you grew up and you made the point in your book. I was surrounded by many people who were 16 that never made it to the age of 17. And that was a very visual way for any of us to try to relate to the surroundings that you grew up in. But there's something more important here, Serrano. When I opened up your book and I went to the first page, there are 3 stars and 4 words, dedicated to my father, and then another 3 stars. I dedicated my book to my dad. Tell me why you dedicated the book to your dad.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting how a single person can make this massive difference. In fact, not only was it a time where I lived in Brooklyn, had the highest murder rate in the country, but there was a point where my dad was like the only dad for probably 3 or 4 square blocks.
Right.
And he had this massive influence on people, but he had this sense of ethics. He had this presence. And literally, people who ordinarily might be, dangerous or acting out, but all of a sudden clean up their act, they hide their drugs.
Well, Serrano, if you could, if I may interject here, take us back to the streets where Mike Tyson grew up, where you grew up, but you grew up with a father that you had as a role model that others may not have. Help us to understand what it was like to grow up on those streets at that time.
Well, I definitely have to acknowledge that, with no perspective at that younger age, right? You don't realize the wider world out there. And a person is always being influenced by something or someone. And I was very fortunate that I really appreciated and I have to say what my father gave was coaching, because he literally worked like 2 jobs and put himself through school while he was working 2 jobs. So it wasn't like he was always physically there, but his presence and his principles were always there.
Right.
And, that actually for me was what I was drawn to, the way in which he was so self-determined.
Right.
And in fact, if you take a look at the environment that I grew up in, there are some massive celebrities that have come out of that environment, Mike Tyson being one, Jay-Z and others, people like them, right?
Yeah.
But those are people where, what we say is they rose above it, right? We use those sorts of phrases. But really what we're talking about is a person's self-determination. And when you see someone else, when you have someone in your life who's so self-determined, it gives you a model. And that model, as in the model of having a coach, as an example, can make a profound difference in the little decisions that a person makes.
I think also his mom, which is not always as discussed, she owned her own commercial property. She owned her own business. She owned her own beauty salon. That was 40, 50 years ago.
Right.
So as a Black female, to own commercial property, to own your own business, I think actually out of the 2, she was a greater entrepreneur.
Right.
His dad was very steady and stable and earnest and just a tremendous presence. But his mom was equally fierce. And I do think that the combination of those 2 strong examples in the midst of that neighborhood created the incredible Serrano that he is.
Indeed. Well, Serrano, I must say, when you think about your path, you headed north a few hours to a college called Vassar, which is a lovely place an hour from where I live. How many people from the Brownsville section of Brooklyn have attended Vassar College, and why did you go there?
At that time,
Yeah.
I think that out of, 2,000 students, there were 25 that were Black males.
Right.
And I can assure you I was the only person with Black.
Right.
Yeah, it was again that the being thrust into an environment that I chose,
Right.
where I was definitely going to be an outsider. There was no
Right.
question about that. The same way that in Brownsville, the decision to focus on academics, the decision to make a difference for people, to not take on some of the less than useful ways of thinking or values. I once again, it was a matter of having that self-determination. And when I say self-determination, I overstate it because it was my own struggle to become even more self-determined. That was the reason for developing the game.
And were you comfortable in the discomfort of being in a place that you had to, I would imagine, constantly adjust to feel like you belonged? Is that how it felt?
You know, I guess it's kind of like the inner athlete. You know, it's interesting how if you haven't gone to the gym for, you go to the gym at first, right? And you're like, oh my God, I'm sore. You know,
right. This is awful.
Right. Then you keep it up, and there's a day that you have a hard workout. You're like, something's wrong. I'm not sore.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not uncomfortable. So
Right.
something's wrong.
Before you know it, you're feeling you've adjusted, and you continue to adjust. Yeah.
So yeah, I developed this appetite for being stretched.
Right.
And for being comfortable with being uncomfortable, which, as we know, is the case with so many high performers across so many areas of life and so many different disciplines. Absolutely.
Right. And Brooke, I'd like to explore a little bit of your backstory, and then I want to bring it all together for your careers and what ultimately led you to a coach. But you had a background in athletics, in particular in a swimming pool. Tell us about that, and what did you learn about yourself in either, as we stated at the beginning of the show, competition, cooperation, struggle? Was that your childhood? Did it have remnants of that?
Had a lot of that.
Copy that, huh?
I remember taking Serrano and our daughter to where I grew up, and I think they were both expecting something a bit more spectacular.
A little more palatial.
Yeah. And where is that?
It was in the San Fernando Valley.
Okay.
And I think what Serrano and I realized was that even though Brownsville had different dangerous elements, we really grew up in actually very similar means. It's just not that it was Brownsville for me. And often people think Pepperdine and USC, blonde hair, blue eyes. Wow. They make certain assumptions, but my
unconscious biases take over.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. And my mom was a single mom. She worked 2 jobs. She got 2 master's degrees. My dad was a teacher in juvenile hall. So I grew up with educators. And I came to swim because my tap dance teacher told me I was the worst dancer in the class.
So you got to find an alternative. Do something else, not this.
Yeah. Put me in soccer after tap dance, and Shelby Coons called on me in 1/2. And so he decided that I was not a land animal, and they put me in the pool.
You're a fish.
And as simple as that is, it actually did teach me to persist.
Right.
And not to be invalidated by a judgment and have that determine something. So even though he said you're not a land animal, it was a very strong message to me that you need to find your lane, you need to find your element.
Right.
And swimming was a place where I learned intensity, I learned measurement, I learned what it feels like to be obsessed with something.
Right.
And I also learned that, when I touched the wall, I would look at my dad's face before I asked the timers for my time. And I realized that behind every great act or accomplishment, there tends to be someone else, to point to the beginning of your show, that is pulling you. Mm-hmm. So I learned quite a bit from the pool, and I would also say swimming is one of those sports where you're in there with boys, right? You're training,
Yeah.
you're swimming, and it isn't quite, there isn't quite as much disparity in swimming as in other sports between men and women. So I think that was where I began to feel very comfortable competing with men, swimming with,
Yeah.
just sort of chopping it up and feeling very comfortable. And so I think that also has led to being, in a largely male industry and feeling at home.
Well, I know when I read this book and Serrano dedicated it to Dad, who are you dedicating this episode to? Who is that one person that was your guide, your coach?
I had an incredible coach.
Let's give you the name.
His name is Steve Reardon. And because my mom was working so much and I had fallen out of my relationship a bit with my dad, he actually took me to every swim practice, would actually drive me to swim meets. He really took me under his wing and made it possible for me to even continue to swim. So I would say that he was the main coach my whole swimming career.
And is he still with us?
He is. He is.
And hopefully he's listening. So Steve, if you're listening, I want you to understand the impact that you had on these two wonderful people who have impacted thousands themselves. You were the bridge that led Sarano and Brooke to do what they do, to go to work every day in the service of someone else's success. Steve, Serrano, what's your dad's name?
Ben.
And is Ben still with us?
Unfortunately, we lost the big guy about 8 years ago, and I miss him to this very day.
Well, Ben is up there with my dad. My dad's name was Fred, who was my guide. So to Ben, Fred, and Steve, thank you for making a difference in our lives. So let's get back to our lives. And Brooke, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's important because let's do one more thing. In retrospect, as you were competing, and swimming is a brutal sport, what did you learn about your future? Did you know that you were going to be in something competitive, either as the coachee or as a coach? Did you envision that?
Here's what I knew. I knew that I was fiercely competitive, but I knew that I used to enjoy as much cheering for a friend and teammate. Her name was Christine Corns. She was an All-American. She was an Olympian, and her family was also kind enough to take me in under their wings. And I got as excited seeing her win and progress as I did at my own wins.
Right.
And I think that was the beginning of me understanding that although I felt inadequate in comparison to her, right? And I didn't like that feeling, that I really enjoyed seeing other people win and studying how they won and looking at the sacrifices they made and looking at the tenacity and understanding the struggle. And it was just this whole world that I think I was unconsciously more fascinated by than my actual pursuit of swimming. I knew that deep inside for sure.
Yeah, so it seems, at least in retrospect, apparent there was something relatable inside your heart that you were gaining the same pleasure by watching somebody else perform that you would yourself. Hence, the coach is born. Serrano, let's get back to you. You and I have a lot in common here because we both went to Wall Street after college, and you began to soar immediately. You were succeeding in a world that we all know is pretty rough and tumble. Tell us about your evolution and the challenges that come with couple hundred cold calls a day, building a business, having to sell stocks and bonds in a world where the person on the other end doesn't want to buy anything from you. Help us understand what that was like.
Well, I have to acknowledge that even though in retrospect it looks like I had this, fast start and, kind of a little bit of a superstar in certain ways, meaning that I was very, very good at cold calling.
Yeah.
What happens is that I'll never forget. I first started and I had difficulty over the phone actually opening even one new account.
Yeah.
And after like 2 weeks, the president asked me into his office. I came in and I sat down and he said, "Have you ever thought about other career choices?"
It's kind of like with Brooke. Hey, you stink at this sport. Have you considered something else? No, I've heard this before.
I would say that probably it was the worst thing he could have said to me and the best thing that he could have said to me.
Right.
Because I was definitely like, "I'll show you." A lot of people don't know that I began life as a stutterer, right? That literally, even at age 6, I could not be understood. That I was just, painfully trapped behind this rapidly moving mind that couldn't catch up with my tongue. And
Right.
there was this sense from teachers like, he's a little slow, maybe there's some learning difficulty. That, part of graduating high school and entering college at 16 years old was a little bit of, I'll show you. And then on Wall Street, there was this, well, I'll show you. And I actually did. Had this, tremendous showing in my first year, worked in the office of the single largest producer in the history of the financial services industry. But then at the end of that year, ran into an incredible brick wall when 4 children in my extended family all tragically died in a fire, in a house fire. And, up until that point, even though on the surface my performance looked good, there was still this frustration that I felt, feeling like I had so much more potential that I just couldn't seem to tap, unless it was like an absolute emergency, right? In which case I would go into like overdrive, right? But it was like, okay, if that's what's possible in an emergency, why can't I access that, ongoingly? And again, it was those sorts of challenges, experiences that were the breeding ground for what later got created as the quote unquote gameless movement.
In fact, this is the great segue where part of the foundation of your collective coaching business is based on people's transformation, which could occur, to your point, in one of 2 things: a tragic event, which is something that you didn't count on, you didn't plan, it happened to you. Maybe it happened for you, but it happened even though you may have had nothing to do with it. So that's the passive end of the transformational change. The second part of it, this is what was really interesting in the book and what I want our listeners to key in on. The second part of that transformation is something that you actively engage in, and it's called the game. And we think about the game as basketball, football, but you had a different idea of what the game is for a very particular reason. As children, we grow up loving games, having games, but there's a foundation, and the first 5 chapters of that book lay out the foundation of the game. I want our listeners to recognize this metaphor, this structure for them to want to play this game. Serrano, could you please explain the foundation of the game and what led you to write the book?
Literally, what we do is we gamify a person's life and we give them 90 days in which to live 90 of the single most engaged and productive days of their life.
Right.
And, I'm able to say very proudly, as my wife and I know, because we're always getting a chance to see people's results at the end of 90 days. The process literally works 100% of the time for 100% of the people who apply 100% of the process.
Right.
By the way, my wife did give me a hard time because when I met her, I was playing the 90-day game. I was single at that time. And basically, I met her and was, immediately madly in love, right? And I asked her to marry me, and it was inside of 90 days.
while you were playing the game, what would have happened if you weren't playing the game?
I'm not going to marry you.
Brooke, what really happened?
His goals written on the wall next to his bed, which is still something to this day that he does.
Yeah.
And I saw them on the wall before he said them to me. I was a little taken aback that I was getting married.
Oh my God! Who knew?
Yeah.
Oh, and what I'd like to do, I want to put this out to our audience, and I want them to think about the foundation of the game. Serrano, I'm going to take this part, and Brooke, and you can pick up on the next part. But I want everyone to think about this in a structure, a foundation with 5 parts: time, structure, affinity, community, and purpose. Now, all of those taken together are the foundation of the game. Explain we don't have the time for each of them, but that foundation, let's jump into the tactics of the game. Why those foundational elements in order to engage?
Well, I'll give you a classic example of the game experience that people have in everyday life that they may not be aware of, but most people find that they're really productive the week before vacation. Why? Right? They were already busy, so-called, right? But why are you even more productive the week before vacation? Because you have a deadline. That's one of the things that games and emergencies have in common is that typically there's a deadline, and usually with emergencies, it's a non-negotiable deadline. It's the same thing with the game. So all of a sudden, when an individual has a purpose, when they have this well-defined set of goals, when they have accountability, when they have a coach, when they're competing, we see this way in which they unleash this untold, untapped potential that was always there, but it just had no reason to be expressed unless it was an emergency.
Right. So just the very mindset of them getting comfortable with the fact that you're playing a game that we typically enjoy, it's almost as if I read the book. We have taken the drudgery out of the blueprint that leads you to change. And you've made it fun, because the last point, as you were as you were teeing, as I was reading this, you were teeing off. Oh, and by the way, have fun. Oh my God, you mean you can have fun doing this? That's what it felt so lighthearted. Like, oh man, this is really good stuff. But you really want me to have fun? I'm not going to get an exam and a test, but you lay down the tracks for what happens in the game. I want to, there's so much in this book, but there is one thing in particular that I really appreciated. And what you talked about is distraction, and how our greatest adversary is distraction. And either one of you, I'm going to ask you to tell the story of the archer who was given a bag of gold, the archer who never misses the bullseye. And I thought this was such a wonderful metaphor for why we often miss our goals. I'm going to leave that to you guys. Great story. Everybody listened to the story of the archer.
Well, Brooke has a lot of experience being in the zone as an athlete, and this particular Zen story really drives home this idea. So what happens is there's this archer who's this famous archer who literally never misses the bullseye, right? And one day a man comes in and says, I bet you this bag of gold that you can't hit that bullseye. He's like, I never miss the bullseye. I don't want to take your gold. At least let me be blindfolded. Even blindfolded, I won't miss. He was like, no, just I bet you this bag of gold. So he all of a sudden went through his ritual movements, let the arrow fly, and he missed it, much to his shock. And then a couple of weeks later, his teacher was coming through the province and saw him and said to him, you seem a bit dejected. What's wrong? He's like, Master, I missed the bullseye. He's like, you never missed the bullseye. How did you miss the bullseye? He goes, well, this man bet me this bag of gold. He said, oh, I see. He's like, you see what? Well, before you had only one target. Because of the bag of gold, you had two. And that is why you missed. And so for all of us, there's this way in which we have this vision or this goal or this direction, but it's always being, as it were, interrupted by external distractions, which are not nearly as big or as frequent as internal distractions. The way that we take ourselves off track, the way that we allow our minds to wander, the ways in which we allow our attention to get fragmented.
And I thought, as I read the book, that was my biggest takeaway, that I see people who are so distracted. Particularly, it's not enough to go to Instagram. You got to go to Facebook and TikTok and YouTube. And we are just constantly in one big landscape of distraction. But thematically, to our listeners, when you play the game, Sarano and Brooke really want you to have the mindset of paying attention to your attention. That no matter how great the foundation is, if you're not focused on one thing, focusing on two means you get nothing. Focusing on one, you now can live up to it. Let me switch, if I may, because I want to go to all of our listeners. Picking up the game is certainly a great transformation. But Brooke, I'd like to change the focus, because you guys ultimately, you do a lot of things for a lot of people, but you've also got a wonderful book out there, and it's a little bit different because it's called Reversing the Deal Flow. And it was a really cool way to think about how to build business. But before we do that, Brooke, could you just lay the foundation? What you and Serrano, either collectively or even individually, what do you guys do in your coaching world, and whom do you do it for?
We tend to serve mostly Wall Street,
Right.
financial service industry, definitely the top performers as well as leadership. We also have a profound commitment to those entering the industry, because we do believe they are the future.
Right.
The majority of what we coach, although it ends up looking like business development and communication. I personally believe what we do is raise the EQ of an industry that has a very high IQ.
Indeed.
So it might look like you're closing more business. It might look like you're prospecting better. It might look like you're being more strategic, and all of those things would be true, but they really are the byproduct of a raised EQ.
Right.
So that's what I believe.
To our listeners, when we think about EQ, there's a foundation and a quad of self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, relationship management. What Brooke is describing is we are all the proverbial iceberg. To the Wall Streeters, our IQ is above the line. It's what people see. It's on display on the trading floor and on your LinkedIn profile. However, what's below the line, what we think, what we believe, what we say to ourselves, whether we're distracted or whether we're focused, no one sees it. We only see it. So for you, Brooke, this is interesting. You're helping people to find the balance between left and right brain, both the tactical engineering archer side and the emotional side that really forms us as a whole human being. Is that a fair conclusion?
I would say we're actually asking them to put their IQ on pause much more because it's so dominant.
Right.
If I told them to balance it, given that they lead with their IQ, I would say I would be remiss. I'm actually asking many of them to have that be dormant for a moment and to really begin to get interested in the other human being deeply, and to see what arises for them differently. So I would say that it's really more about teaching them to develop their EQ. And I will also say that they're all so service oriented that although they reflexively use their IQ, they are incredibly receptive to the coaching on EQ. And I think that that's often why they've also chosen myself and Serrano, because given our life experiences and our background, which I do think are very different from many of our competitors, there's a way that EQ, whether we wanted to or not, we got it, right, from different experiences.
Indeed.
So we love to give that, and I believe it's one of the greatest contributions we're able to make to the industry.
Well, both of your stories are relatable. You hold people accountable, and you know what it's like to be in high performance environments yourself, and you lead by example. Sarano, I want to change the focus a bit to reversing the deal flow, because you talk about in this beautiful work, it's a bit counterintuitive. We grow up in our world. You got to make 100 cold calls. You got to go out there slinging. And in order to be aggressive, you got to think big, dream big. And you said in the book, the world belongs to the big dreamers. But reversing the deal flow flips the paradigm. And everyone needs to hear this and your approach. Tell us about that. Tell us how it evolved and what the book is intended to do for the reader.
Well, in the process of coaching, we've had clients who have literally reversed the deal flow, where prospects are calling them, asking to become clients. In fact, Brooke was on the phone with one of them, coaching them for a big pitch that he's doing, any day now. And it really has a lot to do with strategy. So, anyone's going to be successful understands it's going to require effort, right? It's going to be, there's a way in which there might be a kind of grind. And so that forms almost like a level playing field. It's like, even to be on the field, you've got to be willing to do that.
Indeed.
But what separates people who go to sometimes unimaginable levels is that they figure out some strategy that actually makes them the most useful person in their market niche, such that literally people are calling them, asking if they could become clients.
Imagine that.
I was literally talking to a client earlier. Brooke doesn't know this, and he made a comment. He was like, on one hand, I'm glad to hear that Brooke's practice is so full that candidly there's a waiting list and I can't get in. On the other hand, I'm ticked off by that.
What you're creating is a level of scarcity. We demand what we can't have.
The story behind reversing the deal flow, though, I think is interesting, because one thing that we don't share often enough is that our coaching is always born out of stories. So I think there's some programs that are born out of data. Indeed. And that's not invalid. But I would say that for myself and Serrano, we're really compelled by human beings and their stories, where they're struggling, where they failed. And reversing the deal flow was born out of our own failures as we actually began to pursue expanding our reach, whether it was with the United Nations or more reach inside the financial service industry. It and ended up culminating with meeting Carlos Slim, who at the time was the wealthiest man in the world.
Right.
And realizing that there was an opportunity that he extended that we had to decline, because we knew that we hadn't addressed enough of these steps that we hadn't yet codified, which is now codified in reversing the deal flow. And it was a tremendous loss to us, not just based on his profile. Obviously, there's an element of that, but Sarano in particular had a very deep respect for this opportunity, and it was very difficult man to man for him to have to decline. And I think I know that was the beginning of the birth of us deciding, not only do we never want to have to say no to an opportunity like that, we never want the people that we care about who happen to be our clients to be in that position, because we haven't taken a moment to take a look at what were those steps, what would the bridge from X to Y be. And that was the beginning of codifying 34 different business development strategies, really based on leverage, often executed well by politicians, but not necessarily adopted in business. And that was the birth of reversing the deal flow.
Well, that's a wonderful story. To say no to Carlos Slim it's noteworthy, but what a wonderful learning experience. What a period of reflection for both of you, that you took this moment to recognize something bigger and deeper, but you held on to your integrity, and you recognize that you are the sum total of all of these paths that you've followed, the people that you've met, and the lessons that you've learned. And it's wonderfully exemplified, certainly in the game, and reversing the deal flow, I think, is great. And I recommend it to anyone, because it helps us to think differently about the world and about ourselves. I want to get to one more thing just in our time, Sarano and Brooke. You guys have created, and I think what our listeners not only hearing about what you do for others, but how you brand yourselves, because you represent multiple of mediums, and in particular, television came into your world. Tell us about the evolution of, not just that you were guests on Good Morning America, and that's all wonderful, it's awesome, but you're the creators here. Tell us about the creation of this medium and how it fits into the pieces.
Well, it's funny how that came about, because we were enjoying having resolved certain problems or challenges for ourselves and giving that as a solution to others in the 90-day game. And so there was this one firm on Wall Street that had literally a 7,000% increase in $1 million new clients within just 90 days, right? And that was not because of the markets. So there were folks who caught wind of this, and they both said, hey, what if we gave you a troubled school system? We were like, we don't see any reason why it wouldn't work. So we literally went, and ABC TV did this television show called The Game Winning at Life. And literally in that show, you see us turn around the school system. We hit the financial crisis, the housing crisis, and we get a call once again from Hollywood, hey, we would love to actually do a show where you show literally a celebrity who's homeless. And if you apply the process in 90 days, literally, can you change this guy's life? At the end of 90 days, the guy becomes a financial advisor, profoundly changes his life in that show. And so more recently, there was a documentary on PBS, because when the pandemic hit, we immediately offered people the opportunity to play the game along with us, and and their families. And there was a young woman where the 90 days that she played with us recently was the last 90 days of her life. She was a young mom, but she wanted to end her life on a powerful note, knowing that she was not going to survive. And it was amazing. She turned out to be this incredible inspiration for so many. So, there's this way in which the seeming projects that have come up have really been born a lot out of crisis. And the game has been used to, either handle the effects of the crisis, and in some cases, to get out in front of things before a crisis can actually happen.
Well, what we know about crises, certainly the Churchill never let a good crisis go to waste. And I don't think he meant that to be funny. I think he meant that to be all of us to recognize that crisis and opportunity are born from the same place. And it's each of us to decide how, and this is where the EQ comes in. You act and you react. How do you react to the crisis is the basis of how we take our life forward. I want to end with something that I am so honored to see what you guys do. In addition to helping Wall Streeters or other people in your life, you are dedicated to a cause much bigger than any one of us, and it's called financial literacy. And I want you to leave the listeners, because what you, Brooke, and Serrano have created is a movement. Like the great Martin Luther King or anyone else, they create a cause that is so big, but requires a lot of people to join you in that cause. Tell us about why you chose financial literacy. There may be others. Let's focus on this one. Why is it a cause, and what are you doing about it?
I think for both of us, we both didn't grow up with a lot and then got thrust into worlds, or thrust ourselves into those worlds so that we could create a different narrative. And there was a lot of shame connected to that. And we had made a lot of mistakes on our own. We've seen others make a lot of mistakes. So I think that's the heart of it. But the data is, we were also working with the United Nations, and we were looking at issues like clean drinking water. We were looking at issues like child trafficking, just many issues that pulled at both of us. And for us, when we looked across those different dynamics, we realized the singular commonality was a lack of financial literacy.
Right.
And between our own shame and our own challenges that we have overcome and continue to overcome, and that we see others struggling with, it really is something that I think is born out of a deep desire for both of us to remove that at the youngest age possible. And I do believe it's a way that we also want to honor our parents for the boost, the head start in life that they did not have to give us, that they gave us. This would be sort of our giving it back to them.
Oh, that's just beautiful. You know, you're the living legacy of people that handed you something, and you go out into the world and you hand it to them.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Now, to our listeners, where do they find you guys?
They can go to our website, which is thekelleygroup.net. Certainly you'll find us all over social media, but at our website is where you'll actually gain access to the upcoming events that we participate in, as well as access to the books and other tools like that that are designed to empower you in your day-to-day goals.
Fantastic. I want to leave, and Brooke, I'd like two answers on this. I'd like you to take, let's create a little bit of gender separation here. For all of our female students who are listening, students, clients that are listening in, what do you want them to think and feel about their possibilities? Career, life, otherwise.
I'd like them to redefine what they consider to be the possibilities available to them. Mm-hmm. And I would like for them to think with a very important word that my coach uses with me daily, and it's and. So I think for women especially, you know, I can be a mother, and I can be an incredible wife, and I can pursue my industry, and I can be philanthropic. I think that there's a moment where very thoughtful women get into an either or. And my coach has really impressed upon me an and when I look at what my mom was able to achieve, what Sarano's mom was able to achieve, what I hope to achieve, what I want to impart to my daughter, it has so much more to do with and. So that's what I would love the women listening to really hold on to.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's the art of improvisation. Yes, and always building on the momentum. Indeed. And Serrano, let's speak to the children in Brooklyn, Queens, St. Louis, Los Angeles, wherever they may be. They are growing up in a world that we are in a tumultuous phase in our history. I'm not sure we're ever away from it, but I think we can all agree it's been a tough year. What do you want the children, the teenagers who are eyeing toward college? What do you want them to think? What do you want them to feel? And what do you want them to do?
You know, it's interesting. You brought up Martin Luther King, and I'd like to acknowledge just how one person can make such a profound difference.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
And that we are counting on you because we believe that you are the future. And you are that difference yet to be manifest. And it comes from sometimes the most inexplicable people, places, situations. It's not always quite as, you know, seemingly obvious. Like right now, you may not be having that experience of yourself, but you have tremendous potential. And once unleashed, once you tap into that, the reality is that the blessings will go to many people beyond you. And we look forward to you being able to feel like you had a life that was well lived, even if that life was initially a little bit rough.
You have listened to A Climb to the Top, Stories of Transformation. I am Chuck Garcia and so proud to have hosted Sarano and Brooke Kelley. You can reach them at thekelleygroup.net. Sarano and Brooke, thank you so much for coming on to A Climb to the Top.
Thank you, Chuck.
It's a pleasure to be here at the top with you.
Real pleasure. And to all of you out there that Sarano and Brooke spoke to, keep climbing. Don't just remember the archer, one goal, one focus. Good night to our listeners.